Hello, in this video I want to talk to you a little bit about strategic management considerations for companies when they are going international, and so we would call these their international strategies. So let's just talk at a very high level first about kind of the strategic factors that you would have to consider. Generally speaking, we think in terms of two things that you would consider. First one is degree of local adaptation. And so think of that as whether or not, in order to sell your products internationally, assuming that's the reason that you are expanding, you could sell the same product in all locations throughout the world. And in fact, that's what your customers want. Or do your customers want something that is unique to their locale? And so kind of an example of a low degree of local adaptation might be the McDonald's Big Mac. In fact, when McDonald's first expanded internationally, they thought that they needed to customize their products, so they made the ones in Asia in ways that they thought would be more consistent with the Asian preferences. In Russia, they changed it, and the UK and so forth. And interestingly, the feedback that they got was, no, we don't want a different Big Mac. The whole reason we were excited for McDonald's to come to our country was so that we could get the American experience of Big Mac. And so we want our product back. And so in that case, there was a very low degree of local adaptation required, and in fact desired. People really wanted the product that was the product. Alternatively, you might have a high degree of local adaptation, and that would be where the product that you offer in one country really isn't acceptable to customers in another country without changes. And so some examples that are kind of obvious that are sort of driven by regulations might be with cars, that you can't sell the same car in the UK that you can sell in the US because the steering wheel is on the other side. There are even more specific modifications, that companies rebrand their product, for example, because the name that they use in one country doesn't work in another country, or there are certain features that are more desirable in one country but not another country. So those might be examples of international adaptations that you would need to make. Well, depending on your degree of local adaptation requirement, there are consequences for that. If you want to have products that are very specific to your market locale, then you probably need to have market research that's specific to that location. You may need to do R&D and focus groups and all sorts of things in terms of developing and verifying the specifications of your product for that locale that really ensure that it will meet the customer desires in that area. You'd probably have to have more targeted sales and promotions that really speak to that. Obviously, you can't promote, you can't have an international campaign that is the same in every country, and then have it promoting something that's specific to only one country. And because of all that specification, you would likely need to either, to somehow be able to make the unique product. And so you may have to either have a different production line, or you may have to do different production runs, or those sorts of things. So there are consequences and costs to local adaptation. And so as a result, many companies, if their primary motive for growing internationally is to expand sales into other countries, will simply set up a different business unit in each locale that kind of mimics the original business in the domestic country. And so the idea there is then each one of them has its own fully functioning research department, R&D, sales, production, inbound logistics, outbound logistics, and so it's sort of its own mini version of maybe not so many, but its own version of the original business dropped into the other country. And so that is often referred to as a multi-domestic strategy. And so to kind of visualize that, imagine that maybe your first business you opened in the United States, so that's the domestic country, and then you decide you want to sell into other countries. You actually open the same type of business in all those other countries. still have the headquarters possibly in the U.S., maybe has some very senior executive type functions that are unique to the U.S., but otherwise all of the other stuff that would be done in the business is done in each business in each country. And so they become sort of freestanding in some senses, operating units for each country. Now, the other factor that you might consider is cost. And so that's another potential reason that you might expand. So instead of trying to expand sales, maybe you're trying to expand, to lower costs. So in a low pressure, low cost situation, you're probably not expanding because of cost, so you must be expanding because of sales. And you don't worry so much about costs, so you generally do whatever is easiest in terms of production in particular, but in all the other costs that go along with it as well. Whereas if the reason that you're expanding internationally is because you have a high pressure to lower costs, then you may or may not be so focused on expanding sales, but you're looking to find in other countries lower cost ways of doing what you're doing domestically. And so the consequence of strategically of lowering cost is that, first of all, you tend to centralize your production rather than spreading it out. And so you want to achieve economies of scale in your production. And then you try to place your production facilities in the locations that have the lower material and labor costs. And so you don't, instead of having them everywhere or just having them domestically, you put them in the areas that they make the most sense, really driven based on their cost. And this is referred to as a globalization strategy. And so again, going back to our picture, you may have distribution in all these other countries, but you don't have production at all of these points anymore. You've centralized production, and you may even centralize some of the other functions, marketing and so forth, into just a few places throughout the world based on them lowering cost. So that's kind of the globalization strategy, if you will. So if we kind of put this on a grid, and you think of pressure to lower costs from low to high, and pressure for local adaptation from low to high, you wind up with kind of four possible strategies. We've already talked about two of them. The global is when you have a lot of pressure to lower costs, but you're not too worried about adaptation. Matter of fact, you may not even be selling in the other countries. You may only be selling domestically, and you really only expanded to lower cost. We talked about the multi-domestic, where you're doing it because of sales, and so you want to have different business units in each country. You're not so worried about costs, so you go ahead and put your production next to that. There's the base one, I guess, is what we would call the international strategy. And so the international strategy is usually the beginning point for a lot of folks that are going international. And then there's what we call the transnational strategies. And to think about those, let's kind of fill out the characteristics again. So for international, again, I have the pressure to lower cost is very low, and the local adaptation is very low. And so I can have a standardized product design and put it in the easiest location. The most obvious example of a sort of an international strategy would be a company that still only operates in the in terms of production. They only do production in the country that is their domestic country. They started out only selling into their domestic country. They've got their factories there. All of their development is there. And since there's no local adaptation need, they're going to just take that product and they're going to sell it internationally, but it's still going to be made domestically. So they're not trying to lower their cost. They're not trying to customize their product. They're just shipping their product overseas for sale. So that would be sort of your classic international strategy. Again, if they wanted to lower costs, they would have taken their production and moved it to the cheapest locations globally. If they wanted to improve adaptation, they would have created more specific products but maybe not worried about costs. And then there's this last thing, which is the transnational, and that would be a company that is both looking to expand its sales through differentiation and adaptation, but also to lower its costs. And so that might be a company that basically does have the business units, if you will, sort of the front end, the marketing, the R&D, all those sorts of things. Those might be located in the specific countries so that they can maximize the idea of local adaptation, but they still put the production facilities only in the lower cost countries, and then they have to obviously have different runs for those countries from those production facilities for the different specifications and so forth. So transnational, a much more difficult strategy to pull off, but done successfully, obviously you get the best of both worlds. You both get the higher customized sales in all of the countries, and you get the lower cost in all of the countries, and so that's clearly the best one if you can pull it off. Now that you've sort of decided for your company how it is, you know, what's driving you in terms of internationalization, whether it's sales or cost, and sort of what your overall strategy is, you have to think about making that happen. And that's where we start thinking about, think of it as market entry, that I must now enter the new country. And this is probably more focused on sales, but keep in mind that it could also have production. We have two kinds of factors we think about there. One is control, the other is investment and risk. Control is related to your intellectual property, your research, development, production, distribution, marketing, kind of all the things that define your product as your product. And so in a situation where you have high control, you control all of that. Your people that are employees of yours are responsible for all the steps along the way from the point that the product is made, you know, developed and designed and made, all the way through the point where it gets into the hands of the ultimate consumer. And so you can have high confidence in your products. You also don't have to worry about intellectual property theft or any of that sort of stuff in the same way. However, if we have limited control, that means we're handing over some aspects. So we may be handing over marketing and distribution to somebody else. We may actually be handing over production to them. We could be handing over the intellectual property in some sense, which would kind of go hand in hand with the production and the R&D, so that really all we have left is our brand, possibly. I don't know. So that's one aspect, is how much control do you want to retain versus give up. The second aspect, this investment risk, really comes down to investment, but with the investment comes the risk. Depending on which market entry strategy you adopt, you either have to spend a lot of money putting it in place, in which case you have a lot of risk that you could lose, or maybe not so much money putting it in place, and therefore even if it goes south, you're not really out that much money. And so you characterize that as low. We just didn't have to invest much in it, and so if things go badly, we don't have that much risk of loss. Or high, we put a lot of money into it, and so we have that risk. So again, there are multiple market entry strategies, and you can think of them in terms of those two dimensions. So we're going to start down here at the bottom with exporting. Exporting is, I do everything. I design, it's my intellectual property, R&D. I do everything in terms of making the product, marketing it to you, everything else. The only thing that I don't do is actually have a shop in your local country where I put the product right into your hands. So I sell it to a distributor who then sells it to you. And so I have about as much control as you can have of the product, right? In terms of that, or so it seems, right? And I have very low investment. Now, here's the deal with the exporting. We think we have a lot of control, but in reality, what we're doing is handing our product over to somebody who is not an employee of ours in a foreign country who's not under the jurisdiction of our country. And so that person can take that product and brand it as their own. They can take it and make copies of it and sell the copies and not sell our product. And so in reality, we lose a lot of control through the exporting, and that can sometimes be a problem. At the next level from exporting, we do licensing. So licensing is a step up in terms of, we think of in terms of control, because you are not just shipping the product over there, you are actually creating a legal contract between you and the people who are selling it or who are making it possibly even, that limits them to not doing certain things. And so it costs you a little bit more to enforce that, but it basically says you can't distribute my product in this case, unless you agree to certain rules. And so whereas from an exporting standpoint, somebody in the other country just calls you up and says, hey, I want to buy some of your products so I can sell it in my store, and you're like, fine, here's the product, do what you want with it. Under licensing, they would call and say, hey, I want to buy your product, distribute it in my store, and you would say, okay, you have to agree to the terms of our licensing agreement in order to be allowed to do that. So a bit different. Next step up would be franchising. Franchising is different because what you're actually, what the other person is doing is not saying, the person in the other country, they're not saying, I want to buy your product and sell it in my store. They're actually saying, I would like to open up one of your stores in my country. And so it's got your brand, it's got all your products in it, it's done your way, all of that sort of thing. And so as a franchisee, they have to adhere to a lot more rules. You have a lot more control over the customer experience and what they do, but you also have to invest a certain amount of money into both developing the franchise, helping them put it in place, checking up on it, making sure that they're adhering, all of that sort of stuff. So you have a bit more investment there. And also you're putting your name on the product at that point, not just on the product, but on the entire store. And so you can damage your brand if you do not manage the franchisee and make sure that they are doing things in accordance with what you want them to do. So the next step up from a franchise would be a strategic alliance. So rather than, and in some sense, I guess that is sort of a strategic alliance, but not quite. In a strategic alliance, you would maybe partner with another company. And so you would partner with them in a way that would allow you and them to operate in that country under certain terms. Now, this would be very well spelled out. There would be a lot of give and take. There would be a number of different controls put in place. So your degree of control over what they do with your product is actually higher than a franchise. They don't technically work for you, but the level of the agreements and so forth is quite a bit higher. Now, some people might say that you could flip those two, franchising and strategic alliance. I think it really just depends on the nature of the agreements. Clearly, the next step up from that becomes a joint venture. In a joint venture, you and another party both put your intellectual property and your investments into a third company that you both partly own in the other country. And so now it's not just agreements, you're actually partially invested in another country. And you have a lot more control, obviously, with that, and a lot more day-to-day operational involvement in what's happening in that third company and everything else. But you also now have a company that could fail, and you could lose all of the money, or it could be nationalized or be taxed. There's all sorts of reasons why that could be a problem for you. And so you do have significant risk from that. Now, the sort of last step up the ladder, if you will, is the wholly owned subsidiary. This gives you the most control. You're no longer a partner with somebody. You actually opened your own entity inside the country. These employees are your employees. They do what you say. You put the product in directly into the hands of the ultimate consumer, and so you have the most possible control over the product and the customer experience that you possibly can. At the same time, opening a wholly owned subsidiary that you fund completely on your own requires the most amount of money and therefore exposes you to the most possibility of loss. And so you just have to, if you want that degree of control, it has to make sense in terms of the amount of investment and risk that you're taking from that. So that's kind of everything that you want to think about in terms of international strategy. I know that was a lot in a short period of time, but hopefully you'll find that useful. Thank you.